We're gonna go live. So Berta is now setting up YouTube. Okay, so let's go. Welcome everyone to our fourth session of the Thanks God It's Monday challenge. Today we have an exceptional guest, and you only need to look at his impressive curriculum to realize that. He's been the vice president of Brick House, Yahoo's internal incubator, and today is chairman of OpenExo. He's the best-selling author of one of the world's top business books, Exponential Organizations, and the executive director of Singularity University. Not bad. So very happy and honored to welcome Salim Ismail. Salim, how are you?
Very well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for those that join us for the first time, whether on YouTube or Zoom, you can ask questions via chat and our team will be picking them up and we'll share them with Salim at the end of the interview. So Salim, let's talk about exponential organizations. I guess not everybody in our audience is familiar with this concept. So is this a movement, it's a methodology, or it's both things at the same time?
It started out as an idea and an observation, and it turned into a thesis, and then it turned into a book, and now it seems to be a movement. And worse, it seems to be like a Bible. Now I have people saying to me, hey, if the book stays on track, sometime next year, it will crack into the top 10 best-selling business books ever list. And now people are saying on page 282 on paragraph 6, what did you mean? You know, and I'm like, I don't remember this at all. So the way it started was I was running one-week programs at Singularity University, where I'm the founding CEO, executive director, printer cartridge changer, whatever. And I would run these one-week programs with 80 CEOs in the room. And we would get the question at the end of the week, okay, I get the disruption, got that. What the hell do I do on Monday? And we developed a lecture and a thesis to answer that question. And I started giving that talk, and we called it Exponential Organizations, because we noticed in about 2011, 2012, that we were building organizations in a completely different way. And so we analyzed that, and then it became the most popular talk at SU because of the applicability of it. And then Paul Sappho, a very famous forecaster, futurist, and one of our faculty said, hey, why don't you write a book on this? I'm still shaking my fist at him. So we did 2 years of research and then wrote the book. And now the book seems to be being used by governments and by heads of state and by big corporates and startups. And my publisher is very happy. My wife is less happy.
I can imagine. So, I've read the book. I can say for those who have not read it, it's a fantastic book, really inspiring. And I can totally understand why it's been so successful. When we talk about exponential organizations, there's one thing that's key to them. At least it's key to me when I think of what an exponential organization should be like, and that's the MTP, which you define as the massive transformative purpose. I remember it's almost an anecdote. One guy in our own organization came to work with us. He was working for one of the top Spanish fashion firms. And the reason why he left there is because he was an agile guru and he was very conscious. And he was starting to get concerned because the fashion industry is the second most polluting industry in the world. And he was actually helping that industry, that company, to be more and more agile, to be more and more polluting. So that's why he left, and he had a great job. He enjoyed everything. I mean, the company was a great place to work and he really enjoyed his job, but he left because of this. So I'm wondering, is there a risk that your methodology could be used to create exponential organizations without an MTP that actually grow exponentially for the worse instead of for the better of the world?
Yeah, it's possible, and that's true with any organization, right? But there are a couple of things that I think make it different. So for example, we've noticed that when we did 2 years of research studying the fastest growing unicorns in the world for 3 years and kind of teased out the model. So it's important to note that the EXO model, as we call it, is not an invention that we came up with. We put a label onto a movement that was already happening. People using lean and agile and a massive purpose-driven organization. Conscious capitalism is a key piece of that. But when you use conscious capitalism with decentralized organizations and low marginal cost of supply and information-based businesses and building around community, then you start to get all of the characteristics of an EXO. And we found that along with the massive transformative purpose, there was 10 characteristics, some external, some internal, that had you scale effectively. The thing that was unique and fascinating was that every single EXO had an MTP. Now, it doesn't mean you're operating with best behavior all the time. For example, Uber is an EXO. Its MTP is everybody has a private driver, but they also are a pretty nasty company, and were at the time operating in very dodgy ways, trying to get market dominance, right? Mm-hmm. So it's important to note that you don't have to, but in general, we found that EXOs tend to be much more purpose-driven and consciously aligned than ones that aren't.
Yeah, that's the reason I was asking is because I remember in a previous conversation with you, you told me that actually several governments were actually following your model and were asking for help. And of course, again, I think that's one of the problems of technology and methodologies in general, that you can use them one way or another. It's the problem we had in humanity since the invention of fire, right?
Right.
But yeah, it's one of those things that you wonder if you how do you control the things you create, right? So I guess it's difficult. As long as you don't go to China, I'm fine.
Well, it's very hard. I mean, one of our people did an analysis showing that the Trump campaign ran an EXO campaign, which is very unnerving at the same time in different ways. But the characteristics are out there for anybody to use, right? So it's, again, we've created models in general. You know, here's a key point. We've always used technology and methodologies to transform the world and move it faster and better. You could argue that technology is the biggest driver of progress in the world, right? It might be the only major driver of progress. And so you can use it for good and bad. And the big challenge in terms of how we structure society is, can you get the promise without the peril? And over time, we've done a pretty good job. We tend to extract good things out of technology. I can use fire to heat up my home, and I can use it to burn yours down, right? And we figured out good ways of navigating that over time. But certainly there'll be aberrations of people using it for dodgy purposes.
Yes.
Mark Goodman, who wrote Future Crimes, is a great guest of yours at some point in the future to talk about how do criminals and terrorists use new technologies unrestricted by ethical or moral guidelines, right? And you can learn a lot from that. As another example, the porn industry tends to lead in technology deployment and has done for a while.
Yes. So let's stick for now to the positive aspects of using technology. And let's talk about, let's fast forward into the real future, not just one decade or two. Let's fast forward a few decades ahead of us. So essentially, you have not invented the methodology. You have actually dissected something that was already going on, right? I mean, this was already going on, and you examined what were the main attributes of companies that were growing exponentially fast. So we have something that's happening, that this exponential movement of businesses and technology are evolving faster and faster every time. So now what you are contributing here is the possibility for this movement to actually accelerate itself at an exponential speed. So where it's like a double exponential, things are going to happen faster and faster. So can we imagine a world where one of these EXOs, after a time, gets disrupted by another EXO that improves technology. And if you think, fast forward into the future, and you see this process as a repetitive process, eventually we'll get to the point where one EXO will disrupt the latest version of that business model, and we'll have a company that will run essentially for free. It will be fully automated. You could even think of having an AI run the company instead of an actual person. Where is that taking us? Is that this concatenation of EXOs one after another can transform the concept of business into an infrastructure for the common good, into the commons? And how will that impact our idea of what money is for?
Okay, whoa, there's about 15 questions buried in what you said. So not fair. I call time out. So let me touch on a few. You've hit a very, very important point. So let me touch on kind of a few of the points you made. One is definitely EXOs disrupt other EXOs. Okay, and in fact, the definition is that you should be disrupting yourself on a nonstop basis. So you have a model, and you come up with a new model, put it at the edge. If it succeeds, that becomes the new gravity center, and you're kind of ratcheting your way into progress. And the ideal is you become a nonstop learning organization. Okay, so when we advise big companies, we say create a portfolio of EXOs at the edge, and little by little, that one of those will become the new gravity center. It's very Darwinian, very, very efficient because you're not placing a big bet on any of them, and then you can progress very, very quickly. And the key thing we've worked on the last few years is the idea of how do you solve the immune system problem so you don't have legacy resistance as you apply this approach, right? So definitely we'll get to a point where EXOs are transforming and changing other EXOs because the world is changing fast and organizations have to adapt. I did a really interesting exercise, which is worth mentioning. So about 5 years ago, Singularity University was about 8 years old, and Peter had an offsite board meeting and said, hey, can you come to this offsite? We want to put out a vision of what SU should look like in a few years. And they asked me, and I asked a question at this offsite board meeting. When we created it in 2008, many of the tools weren't there. We didn't have MOOCs, we didn't have e-learning platforms, social media wasn't a big deal. Now the world is fundamentally different. We should think about what would we do today if we had to start SU from scratch, right? And so the board said, interesting idea. Why don't you go think about that and come up with something? So I went off and I tried to do it, and I tried 4 separate times to envision what would you do, and I failed every time. My mind kept, because I was so successful in the model that we did create, that my mind kept going back to that model, right? And it's a really brilliant, amazing case of you cannot disrupt yourself. You're too much in the soup. You have to have other things do it for you. So then you have an ecosystem approach where people in the ecosystem ideally are disrupting you, and you just progress the world forward at a more rapid pace. Now, the magic of an EXO is the fact that you have low marginal cost of supply. And can I take a minute and just describe this?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Let me talk through the core economic thesis of why this works. So imagine you have a small footprint like an Uber or Airbnb, and then you scale using, or TED scales using community with TEDx events, or Uber is scaling by not hiring its own staff, or Airbnb is scaling by not owning its own assets, right? So some characteristic allows you to scale quickly. Here's the core economic thesis on why this is so profound. When you're running a business, you're worried about demand and supply, and very importantly, the cost of demand and the cost of supply, and hopefully you're on the right side of that equation. When the internet came along, it allowed us for the first time in the history of business to drop the cost of demand generation exponentially. Online marketing, referral marketing, every Silicon Valley company is trying for the holy grail of a viral loop. And if you can get there, your acquisition costs go to 0, which is kind of a magical place to be. Okay, and that's great. And we've seen now an explosion of companies, Facebook, Google, others that have low marginal cost of demand. What EXOs have figured out is how do you drop the cost of supply exponentially? So Airbnb's marginal cost of adding a room to their inventory is like near 0. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a hotel, right? And now, and same with Waze, same with Uber, same with a BlaBlaCar, etc. Now you have startups entering legacy industries with zero marginal or near zero marginal cost of supply. That's an existential threat to the incumbents. Okay. Now, when you can do that, it means that in the future, almost every company will end up like this. And you end up with what Jeremy Rifkin calls the zero marginal cost society. And that book came out about the same time as EXO came out. And so now you have a really interesting paradigm where money becomes less relevant and now becomes your consciousness and your focus and your motivation that becomes very important, which is why we're so aligned with the conscious capital movement in general. And so you can build companies with very low marginal cost and it will disrupt everything. We're now starting to hear that in the future, if you're not building an EXO, you're not building a startup. Every startup will be an EXO because it's just better. And so that's kind of where we see the world going.
Okay, so then I guess the answer to the last of my questions is a yes. We're going towards a world where a lot of what today are businesses will become infrastructures that will be run essentially for free, like or for a small access cost, like today we access
That's right.
For free, like the internet, right?
Right.
Yeah. In fact, you mentioned Jeremy Rifkin. He's going to be one of our next guests. So it will be great to catch up on this question with him as well. In fact, one of the and continuing along this line as we move into that direction, I mean, I think that you can envision a world of abundance, like the one we're describing, where all our needs are covered. We don't need to work. I mean, it's not that we can't work at all. We can work on things that actually fulfill us. But if we don't want to work, we can't work, we don't need to, because there's enough for everybody. Yeah. My concern is the transition to that world. Yeah, because that's going to be tough.
It's the thing that keeps us up at night. And actually now our entire movement, our EXO ecosystem is focused on that problem, that transition, because we have two paths for humanity right now. We have a Star Trek path with abundance and natural resources, abundant energy via solar, etc., or we have a Mad Max path. Right, and our politicians and our constructs, global constructs like country-based competitiveness, etc., are driving down a Mad Max path. Right, and Corona is accelerating that paradigm. So what we have been going down that Mad Max path, and the global super tanker is suddenly ground to a halt. And what we're saying is, let's grab the wheel and turn it, because we can actually go to this thing, and it's very easy to get to. You can imagine people with a universal basic income, and folks that are not familiar with this, please go research this. We're pretty clear that's where we end up, because the evidence shows that this is the best model that we have right now. But in a world that's dominated by labor unions and taxation and jobs and economy and employment and whatever, how we have no confidence in our political structures to take us from A to B. And we're seeing Corona as that opportunity, so we're kind of pushing hard for that model.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned UBI, Universal Basic Income. Yeah, that's definitely something that had been in the back burner for a long time, and all of a sudden everybody's talking about it. And as you said, the COVID-19 is actually an accelerator, or at least changing the narrative, right? Yes. That takes me to the last part of my previous question, actually. Moving on to a world of abundance where we have these infrastructures, these commons that basically provide for everything we need. We could think that we have a universal basic income, or we can simply access that for free without any income at all. Do you envision a future where we'll just learn to collaborate and will not need money? I don't know when that future is going to happen, but do you think that the money is really a myth? It's what actually bonds us together so that we actually work. Yeah, we work because we need the money, but it's a myth. Money is nothing. It's just it's something that we believe on so that we can collaborate efficiently. Right. if money didn't exist right now, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to redistribute wealth. We wouldn't know what to do. But when you look at your body, cells collaborate without money, right? And they know what to do. And we could potentially also know what to do, except that we have not learned how to do it. Do you think that as we move to this world of abundance, money will become more and more irrelevant to the point that eventually, I don't know exactly when, money will no longer disappear and we'll rely on another myth that fosters collaboration without money?
I think it's doable and it's going to happen, and it's happening now. And here's the stepping stones as we've seen it. You know, money's been incredibly successful over the last few hundred years in lifting us out of power structures. And let's equate money to power, okay? And also energy. Money is essentially energy. And a few hundred years ago, all the power was in religious structures or feudal systems. And capitalism and the Renaissance have lifted us out of that. And now money flows much more equally to where the best ideas are, etc. 100 years ago, the richest people in the world exclusively had inherited their wealth, right? None of them had earned it. Today, almost exclusively the richest people in the world have earned it. Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, etc. And so that's a really profound point. Somebody with a laptop can become the richest person in the world by putting good ideas into play. And so that's a fundamentally important shift. Now we can generate value, and what value looks like today is represented by money. But note that today we're converting money into information. A startup is much more interested in gathering data about its users than money upfront, because it can convert them later. And the more you can invest in the data, the more money you can convert it to later, right? So today they're already fungible. I envision a time when we kind of move through this transition fully and we don't worry about money in the same way, because the three needs for money, which is, you know, unit of account, means of exchange, storage of value, are all done by other things. And now we can basically move the world forward in a very different model. And I think that's coming very quickly. It's happened already in the startup world, but as we reach abundance, money was very useful to pull us out of scarcity, right? But as we reach abundance, let's say, you know, it's very clear in the next few years, we'll have abundant energy. That's very clear. We can see the path to it. It's this decade. That means abundant energy gives you abundant water because desalinization becomes free, et cetera, and the ripple effects start becoming very profound. Why do you need money in the same way? And so really, money was great in a world of scarcity, is less relevant in a world of abundance. The UBI concept has not succeeded so far because most of the 14 experiments that have been run have not been true UBIs. The ones that have been true UBIs have been staggeringly successful. And so we're because entrepreneurship explodes when you know your basic needs are covered, right?
Yep.
And you can see the difference in the Europe social protection layer versus the US, right? The people don't feel safe in the US, and therefore everybody's buying guns right now instead of anything else. As we kind of come through that, then we basically can move the world into a new model very quickly.
And talking about that, about this transition to this new world, I'm wondering what's going to happen to money, what's going to replace money, probably purpose, and how that's going to impact industries such venture capital. We can already see how VC firms are incorporating purpose into their investment criteria. And but my question goes beyond that. I'm thinking that as entire industries become demonetized faster and faster, and one EXO demonetizes the previous one, when that starts happening at an exponentially fast speed, I think that the mindset of investors is going to have to change, because now that mindset is a linear mindset, right? They basically use the discounted cash flow methods to decide how worth a company is, but those methods don't factor in the demonetization properties of technology. When you factor that in, it might be that a successful investment becomes demonetized 10 years later. And when that starts happening...
Right now, successful investments are demonetizing environments anyway. So for example, I have in the other room a pad this big, about 20 centimeters. And a woman would put this on left and right side of her chest to detect breast cancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it costs $20 and it's FDA approved, created by a guy from Barcelona. Alex Ness is the CEO. Now you can eradicate breast cancer by early detection, okay, for about $20 once or twice a year. Now this hits GDP because the people selling the $10 million radiation mammogram machines don't have anything to sell. GDP goes down, but the health goes up. And there's about 100 examples of that where we demonetize the economy, but we live better.
That's a very interesting concept, right? How the more value we create, yeah.
That's right. So GDP is not a measure of wealth anymore, right? And certainly not a measure of good health and purpose-driven ideas. It is absolutely not that at all. So we have to figure out ways of shifting past it. But note how all our global narratives are about what's the stock market, what's the GDP, we expect, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to shift that narrative pretty fundamentally, and it's going to take 10, 20, 30 years to do it. So
I guess what we need is to define new units of measure, purpose-driven units of measure for ROI and for
That's
GDP,
right.
even for ROI. I mean, from a VC firm point of view, ROI, return on investment, probably at some point will not
disappear.
Money.
Disappears. Yeah, I think you go through a progression of return on investment to return on demonetization almost, and eventually you'll go to return on learning, return on consciousness, return on purpose.
Right.
And so that's when our worlds merge fully, is when you bring that together.
I guess the challenge there is how to get an objective unit of measure.
Exactly. That's one, but now we have more and more mechanisms, right? Like just as an example, at this event we did last week, Exo World, we talked about the idea that we can now use psychedelics and microdoses of psychedelics. And we know now through fMRI and brain scans, the exact impact of this amount of dosage of MDMA or whatever on your brain. So now we can actually train you can take the exact amount to achieve the desired effect. And with that feedback loop, we get unbelievable potential to how we want to activate.
Mm-hmm. So we're actually, it's amazing how time flies when you're having fun, but we're getting towards the end of the interview. And I guess I wanted to ask you a couple of questions before we open a quick round of questions to the audience. This is obviously very much everything we've been discussing is extremely well connected to conscious capitalism. So could you give us a quick, what's your quick view of what conscious capitalism means and how businesses can contribute to accelerating this shift in consciousness in humanity?
Yeah, so I think what appeals to me about conscious capitalism we found is the most efficient tool for progressing society forward that we've ever found. When you add the consciousness layer and have a purpose-driven organization, environment, ecosystem on top of that efficiency, essentially we can move the world forward in a really magical way. And that's why we're so attracted by and guided by a lot of the work being done in the conscious capital movement. We had a whole big chunk of it at this event we did last week. And so I'm super excited by the fact that you can take purpose-driven thinking and missions with the inherent efficiency and real world viability that comes with the capitalist tendencies, market-driven environments, et cetera, that bring the best ideas forward very quickly. John Mackey, I think, summarized it very well last week. He said, we should be thinking not of capitalism, but as innovationism. Right. And innovation drives the world forward.
Mm-hmm. There's one question that I definitely want to ask you, which is connected with artificial intelligence. 70,000 years ago, biological intelligence took an incredible leap by creating what's called the neocortex that gave rise to the cognitive revolution. Now, artificial intelligence seems to be accelerating that cognitive revolution. It seems to be the new revolution. Now, it's not been proven yet that consciousness and the intelligence that comes out of consciousness actually is the outcome of biological or artificial intelligence. We don't know if machines are going to develop that. If that was not the case, of course, that would bring up the question of where's consciousness coming from. But without getting esoteric,
how do you not get esoteric on this one? Okay, but go ahead with your question.
The question would be, more than accelerating the cognitive revolution through artificial intelligence, which could take us in the Mad Max road that you defined before easily, wouldn't it be more important that we go into a conscious revolution?
Yeah. So I think what will happen, what's likely to happen is we build the world through abundance, then you basically don't need the same forms of competitiveness that you had before. Okay. And so therefore, if you have, like, say, abundant energy, you basically wipe out a fundamental need for competitiveness in a lot of different areas. And we don't need to fight about scarce resources. Think about the idea that we've fought for 50,000 years about scarce resources, right? And as resources become abundant, why are we fighting? We don't need to fight. Now it's an artificial construct driven by politics. We don't really need to fight. And as we enter that world, we need to rewire our brains. Your comment about the neocortex is very important, because the neocortex didn't actually replace the old limbic reptilian brain. It just laid on top of it, right? And it can be activated at any time. And actually, this is how religions work. All religions take a young child below the age of, say, 7 and give them some absolute truths like Muhammad is the last prophet, Mary is a virgin, Jesus is the son of God, whatever. And then you bind it in with ritual repetition and a lot of sugar, right? And then that infects, it goes into the limbic system. And when you provoke it, it creates a fight or flight response. And so we need to kind of rewire ourselves globally and anthropologically to operate more from our neocortex and more from our spirit. I think of AI as a positive thing that takes more and more of our processing functions and moves it into a more objective layer. You just need to make sure that the algorithms are objective and operating on a fair basis, because we have a lot of garbage in, garbage out problems today.
So that would be, to me, what you just described, learning to rewire the brain so that we rely more on the neocortex than on the amygdala. That would be my definition of the conscious revolution then.
Exactly right. Exactly. And we know now how to do it, right? We've had old techniques like yoga, martial arts, meditation. Then we developed newer techniques, neuro-linguistic programming, biofeedback rhythms, CBT. And now we have psychedelics that leapfrog you there very quickly. And we can actually train exactly the amounts. And the work, say, that Stephen Kotler is doing on psychedelics and flow research are really profound.
Okay, great. Well, we're definitely running out of time. So we have time for two quick questions, and then we'll ask Salim about his preference for our next guest. So please, Berta, are you connected? Can you pick up two of the questions and go ahead with them?
Hi, Salim. So we have a couple of questions for you. One is from Anne Rayleigh, and she says, what are some exponential organizations that you admire and why?
Okay. What are some EXOs? So we have a whole list called top100.exponentialorgs.com. We have about 100 of them. One of my favorites is GitHub, which is a company of about 35 million developers, where they have a platform that allows them to collaborate. They use all 11 of the characteristics. Their MTP is social coding, because we have good evidence that developing software in groups gives you a good outcome. The magic of GitHub is they went from 0 to being sold for $7.5 billion a year ago. And what's even more incredible is this company has no assets, no workforce, no intellectual property, right? So you talk to the accountants and they're like, what the hell do I put on the balance sheet? And how can you create so much value with no assets and no IP, no nothing? What is this thing? And so that's what's possible today. And I think it gives a great example of what's so fundamentally different about the world today than, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Great. So one more, and that's it.
Okay. And the next one would be, they are asking, what will be the pains in society in that exo transformation transition process, and which are the best possible ways to minimize these pains?
I think the biggest pain by far that we're seeing is what we call the immune system problem. Anybody who's been in a corporate innovation environment knows when you try anything disruptive, the antibodies attack you. And then you're stuck in kind of a political fight. It's much worse in the public sector because in the public sector, existing policy is the immune system, right? Bankers are fighting Bitcoin, taxis are fighting Uber, and we have no way of updating our old institutions and infrastructure in an elegant way. We usually end up in war, and war is not a good way of progressing humanity. And so we've been working on tool sets in our OpenEXO ecosystem on how do you solve that immune system problem. And we're pretty thrilled with the outcomes. We found now process frameworks that take 10 weeks in the private sector, 16 weeks in the public sector to transform legacy immune system thinking so you don't get into that fight. And then we progress the world forward more quickly. As those types of tools, which we're open sourcing, become more widely available, it means we can take great ideas and implement them very quickly. So we're very, very excited by that layer of capability that we finally gotten to, because now we can go into any legacy environment and train it. Probably academia is one of the worst immune systems in the world. And try and update academia and watch the response and you'll see.
That's true. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Salim. Let's go with the final question of the interview. Who would you like to invite to our next session? Why, and what's the question that you would ask him or her?
Okay, I'm going to cheat here and give two, and you guys can pick. One is Jerry Mikulski, who has done an amazing amount of thinking on trust. And he has a great definition that scarcity equals abundance minus trust. And if you can develop systems on trust, then we can get to abundance more quickly, and we don't need scarcity. And so that's a profound transition. He knows that all of our institutions globally are built on mistrust. Government structures don't trust you. They're saying, do you have the right passport? Do you have the right age? Do you have the building permit? What if we could build institutions on trust? And I think it would propel that movement forward. So that's kind of at the macro level. And my cheat is the second one would be Stephen Kotler, who's done a lot of research on the individual and how do you be in flow states. And now we can measure and we know what neurotransmitters to tweak. When we get to a prescriptive model of defining flow, we can kind of decide who we want to be at any time. And it goes right back to Aristotle and Plato asking the question, how should we conduct ourselves? And in an incredible way, after 3,000 years, we're kind of at that question of being able to ask and answer, how should we conduct ourselves? And I think that is the inquiry that we need to push forward. And we've been working on that in our EXO World thing. So I'm going to do a quick plug. May 12th, we're doing a replay and rerun of some of the top scenes. So May 12th, we'll be doing a one-day event around all of these topics.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we'll definitely try to get them. We count on your help to contact them as they are your friends. So
I see the model that you're working off. That's great. I love it. Thank you for doing this, by the way. It's a really important initiative.
It's been great having you. I could talk for hours with you, and I know that you would be able to talk for hours as well because I've seen you before do this. So, but unfortunately, we don't have time, and we have to leave it here. Thanks a lot, Salim, again, and looking forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
All right. Thanks, Harvey. Great to be here.
Thank you.